Yes, welcome again so much to the first webinar of our Walkshop 2025 on nuclear weapons and long-term peacekeeping. So yeah, Walkshop again as our educational initiative that we're hosting at the Foundation for the Rights of Future Generations. We are an advocacy group and think tank from Stuttgart in Germany, working for the rights of future generations and intergenerational justice. And this year's Walkshop, which is a series that we've been running for the last 5 years, is our educational initiative to do a mix of, well, to essentially say that you can learn better while you're walking. And we're doing that with different topics of intergenerational justice. And this year's topic is nuclear weapons and long-term peacekeeping, as I've said. And in that sense, we have been hiking all day. We'll be doing that for the next 3 days. We've been learning a lot today about nuclear weapons and the risks they pose and our efforts for long-term peace. And today's webinar will be about nuclear arms control in an increasingly nationalistic world. And today we have a fabulous panel of experts that I am so happy had time and wanted to come and join us and participate today. And so we've got Matt Korda, Jack Crawford, Professor Benoit Pelopidas, Andrew Baklitskiy, and Dr. Tong Zhao. And if you would just like to, we will kick this off with an introductory round by each of the experts to introduce who they are, what they work with, what organizations they work with, and what their research area is. And then we'll do a circa 45-minute of a moderated discussion / conversation to kind of get it going. And then we'll do a Q&A from our workshop participants and any other participants from the audience that have joined externally who can post questions into the chat that I will read out then. But yeah, let's get going. And whoever would like to start, maybe Matt, I have you first on my screen if you want to start introducing yourself.
Sure. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me. It's lovely to see everyone. I'm extremely jealous that I could not be there in person to join you on that hike. It sounds amazing. I hope you guys are not too exhausted from this, as Benoit said. I personally would be. But I think it should be a pretty interesting discussion. So my name's Matt Korda. I'm the Associate Director for the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists, which is a research organization and think tank based in Washington, D.C. What we focus on at FAS is we try to produce the best non-classified estimates of global nuclear arsenals and trends. And the goal of that research is to empower folks like yourselves, interested people, the public, policymakers, journalists, activists, advocates, whoever it is that can use this data with the factual information that they need to understand what's going on in the world of nuclear weapons. And so we do this using open sources. So we look at things like budgetary documents, we look at treaty information, we submit Freedom of Information Act requests, we look at a lot of satellite imagery, things like that. And why do we need to use open sources? It's largely because countries who have nuclear weapons don't really like to talk about them very much, right? Some countries do more than others, but on the whole, a lot of this information is secret. It's policy decisions about nuclear weapons are taken behind closed doors and away from the public eye, even though from our perspective, the public has absolutely a right to know about these things, and the public is in fact a key stakeholder in nuclear policy because nuclear policy does affect all of us. So that's really kind of the core of what we do. And yeah, I guess I can pass it over to Jack. You're the next on my screen.
Thanks, Matt. I equally echo. This sounds like a great trip. I'm going to keep my eye out for the next one of these. This is so cool. I apologize for the red glow. I've got this curtain trying to block out the heat, and it's casting this kind of like nothing's on fire. But I'm aware that I'm more red tinged than most of my other panelists. I'm Jack Crawford. With that, it's very nice to meet all of you. I'm a research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute for Defense and Security Studies in London. I'm also known as RUSI. I sit specifically within our proliferation and nuclear policy team. We have a wide remit covering, in theory, everything to do with proliferation and nuclear policy. In practice, these days, what we're looking at mostly is a handful of pressing issues. So the one thing that we're starting to engage with more, no guesses as to why, is understanding the role that countries think deterrence plays these days in nuclear weapon systems and the risks of this new nuclear age. We have a couple of projects looking at how do you stop the spread of nuclear weapons and their means of delivery. We're also doing some stuff on chemical weapons and biological weapons. And then one of the initiatives that we've been running for a long time and have just redoubled down on with some new initiatives is building nuclear policy networks and encouraging learning about these issues. As Matt said, the public is a key part of the nuclear weapons, nuclear policy debate. And for the last couple of decades, no one's been doing it, and not of their own volition, right? Not it's no one's fault except for the fact the governments have decided that these are things that are maybe not easy to talk about in the public space. So, not to tout the work of FAS too loudly, although I plan on doing that later in some of the remarks that I have separately. But that's kind of what we're trying to do on this side of the pond in the UK is create a community of practice of next generation / mid-career people to re-engage with some of these issues in a way that, in particular in the UK, and I'd be curious if this has come up on some of the Walkshop that no one's really been doing here for quite a while.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll just pass it on to Professor Pelopidas if you would like.
Hi, so hello everyone, I'm Benoit Pelopidas. I'm also delighted to join you, and I want to just show appreciation to the organizers of this, but also to the hikers for actually caring about an unusually unpleasant topic. So I'm Benoit Pelopidas. I teach these things in Paris at Sciences Po. And in one word, the thing I did is create a research and teaching program called Nuclear Knowledges, which stands out for two very simple reasons. The first one is that we refuse any funding carrying conflicts of interest to fund our analysis. So we're not taking money from the builders of nuclear weapons or anti-nuclear activists or the ministries of defense of nuclear weapon states, simply because it has been demonstrated that taking that kind of funding produces all sorts of self-censorship effects. And the other thing is that I've created an interdisciplinary team which is designed to be able to assess the effects of the nuclearization of world politics in general and of states in particular. So in 1 second, I'm going to give you a sense of the kinds of findings that kind of an approach produces, and that echoes, I really like Matt used the word empowerment. I really connect with that notion because our role is, I don't see our role as telling you what to think, but our role is to essentially show you that you have choices when a lot of the conversation creates the illusion that there's no alternative to the existing path. So the type of findings that we had are, for instance, the role of factors beyond control in avoiding unwanted nuclear explosions. In several instances, we've simply been lucky. Or the ability to show that acquiring nuclear weapons produces effects of de-democratization in creating pockets of nuclear secrecy and obstacles to nuclear accountability. The role of the P5 in promoting proliferation and things along those lines. So I'm going to tell you more about this in the conversation. Looking forward to it. And then I need to pass the baton to Tong.
Well, thank you so much. It's real pleasure to be in part of this group. And thank you to the organizers for doing this. And I also appreciate the interest of this group in this topic. Personally, I'm currently working as a senior fellow at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And I work for two programs, the Nuclear Policy Program and Carnegie China. I came to this field of nuclear security from a technical background. I was trained as a physicist. So I started with research in the interdisciplinary area of science and arms control. and have since been working on issues related to nuclear weapons, deterrence, arms control, non-proliferation, etc. I also follow how emerging military technologies, such as hypersonic weapons and missile defense, AI affect traditional nuclear relations among the major powers. I'm also affiliated with the Princeton program on science and global security. That program has done a lot of important work on civil advocacy. I'm very excited to learn that your program is also interested in advocacy. And I think there's an interesting connection between think tank, which is where I work primarily, and the advocacy world. The longer I work in this field, I feel that it is more important that we think through the challenges we are trying to resolve before we take on a certain position and promote a certain solution. So that's why I particularly appreciate your interest in developing some more nuanced understandings on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And then, yeah, last but not least, Andrey, Baklitskiy, please. Thank you. So sorry, but I can't hear you. I don't know about the rest. Just try again, maybe. Still can't hear you, unfortunately. Maybe I don't know. Okay, maybe we'll just try again. Give him like a minute or two to log back on before we start with the conversation. But thank you all so much for introducing yourselves. And yeah, and we're really excited. I mean, our whole goal with this is really to educate and kind of, yeah, allow the participants to turn into peace multipliers and actually think about solutions and more sustainable and long-term solutions. I mean, with our organization, we're all about future generations and intergenerational justice. So it's really thinking about the long term, which unfortunately is very rarely the case in current politics, and is needs to be much more put into focus. But yeah, it's that essentially that can develop and think about solutions for long-term peace and take that away from this workshop. That would be ideal. So yeah, that's what we're really excited to do today. And yeah, hopefully Andrey can come back and introduce himself as well, which would be fantastic. Otherwise, we could also just start off, because the first question I was gonna ask as part of the conversation was gonna go to Matt anyways. So we'll just start off with that. Hopefully it'll work in a second. There we are. Maybe we can actually try it again. Hopefully. Unfortunately, we still can't hear you. Oh no.
How about now?
Yes. Okay, we can hear you.
Okay.
Perfect. Oh, amazing.
So this is going through my laptop, not through my headphones. So I hope you can still hear me.
Yes, now we
Sorry.
can. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, perfect. Third time's the charm, please.
Yeah,
Yes.
my name is Andrey Baklitskiy. Good evening to everybody. I'm a senior researcher at UNIDIR, which is UN Institute for Disarmament Research, but I'll be speaking obviously in my personal capacity. The positions would be not of UNIDIR or the UN. I'm very much happy to see you all here, because nuclear weapons research sometimes leads you to very dark places. So kind of sharing it with everybody is maybe a little bit of psychotherapy. So we'll see how this goes. UNIDIR is an autonomous institute in the United Nations, which is tasked with doing research in all things disarmament. I work in the WMD program, mostly on nuclear things. My key topics at UNIDIR are nuclear risks and how to reduce them, but of course I also follow everything else which is going on. Iran takes a lot of time now, but other things before that, and before joining UNIDIR, I was in Moscow in different research institutions for about a decade.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And again, thank you all so much for being here. Really excited about this. But yeah, let's get started because we have a lot to talk about. Honestly, when I was trying to compile the curriculum for this workshop, I kept having to change things because things kept happening. So yeah, we've had all these. I think it's a more important conversation than ever right now, with obviously recently Iran, Israel, and before that we had India, Pakistan tensions. We still have the Ukraine-Russia conflict going on. And so yeah, let's get started. Please, Matt, if you could, given the current geopolitical climate and the recent escalating tensions, tell me or tell the group how we can ensure effective nuclear arms control and what, in your opinion, are the biggest current challenges?
Yes, it's a great question. Wait, can I ask really quickly, how long should I chat for? Because this is like a book level answer, or I can give a 30-second answer.
Yes, no, maybe let's aim for, so we'd like to have all of you guys talk at least once before we do the Q&A. So ideally maybe like 5 minutes. I
Oh,
feel
yeah,
like if
okay.
someone else wants to jump in, like let's not do a hour-long lecture, but maybe like have
Yeah,
a
yeah.
bit of an
Oh,
in-depth answer, but obviously not just a 30-second answer. And then maybe someone else can also jump in if they want to. But yeah.
sure. No, this is great, and it's a great question. So I where we are at right now is that with regards to arms control, for the first time in basically 50 plus years, we are living today in an era of essentially no more great power arms control, right? So there's one treaty remaining, right? The New START treaty, the last bilateral arms control treaty between the United States and Russia. It technically remains in effect for another almost a year, but neither country is complying right now with the most critical elements, right? And this is a serious problem, right, for mitigating the arms race, because both the United States and Russia have meticulously planned their forces based on the assumption that neither country is going to exceed the force levels dictated by New START. And so if New START is dead, then that assumption goes out the window, right? And both sides will likely default to what they have done before, right? Which is mutual distrust, because we have fewer data points to verify each other's arsenals. The discourse is going to be dominated increasingly by worst case thinking about how each country's arsenals are going to grow in the future. And, this is something that you can see, in the United States, certainly like the domestic rhetoric against arms control, against engaging with other countries that, yes, on the one hand, you can call them adversaries. Another way of looking at them is prospective arms control partners, right? This is just a different framing. Of course, that's not really how the political climate in the United States is oriented right now. And so that is certainly like a big challenge, right? Is just getting over this domestic hump. But without, working treaties or legal limits or a mutual agreement or anything like that, in a worst case scenario, the United States and Russia could potentially double their deployed nuclear arsenals maybe in a year or two, right? Without even necessarily building a single new weapon, right? It's just pulling these weapons out of storage, uploading them to existing deployed systems, and then all of a sudden you have a significantly larger nuclear arsenal. A challenge there as well is that, this rush to rebuild would be really visible, right? You would be able to see this on commercial satellite imagery. You'd certainly be able to see it using national technical means, right? Government satellites, military satellites. That creates really significant instabilities, right? And so the pressure on both states to upload faster than the other, right? You would have this mutual perception that one state is uploading more than the other, right? That raises real risks that could trigger nuclear threats, ultimatum. And in the best of times, I think this would worry kind of any reasonable observer. And then in a time of crisis or conflict, maybe that's a legitimate driver for preemption, right? And that's what we might call crisis instability, right? Which is present when during a nuclear crisis, one or more countries perceive it to be in their interest to strike the other with nuclear weapons first. That is not a good place to be. It's unfortunately where we find ourselves in a lot of different hotspots around the globe, not just, potentially in this future scenario with the United States and Russia, but also India and Pakistan, right? There are a lot, you could think of North Korea, right? You could think of like a lot of different situations in which it might be in a country's interest to use nuclear weapons very quickly at the outset of a conflict or potentially a crisis. There are a few ways to try and address that, right? And to mitigate the drivers of crisis instability, right? So one is establishing more checks and balances on leaders' abilities to launch nuclear weapons in a crisis, right? So the current system, which is very much derived from the Cold War era, empowers leaders to launch nuclear weapons without consulting anyone other than the launch officers on duty. That is not necessarily true of every country, but it's certainly true in many countries, right? And given that these leaders can be subject to a variety of distortions, right, which can include disinformation, misinformation, a lack of information, their own like psychoses. I don't know what word to use there. But it's really important, right, for global security that there be these extra steps, these checks and balances inserted into the launch processes just to add a little bit more to decision time. Additionally, these challenges would be they would be easier to manage if countries had the means to talk to each other during crises. But nuclear-armed countries do not talk to each other as often as you might think that they do, or as often, certainly, as they should, right? Certainly, there are several bilateral nuclear hotlines that exist at the head of state level for some countries, at the military to military level for other countries. But not all countries with nuclear weapons are linked up to each other. And in an age when nuclear crises would inevitably involve more than just two countries, there are no multilateral nuclear hotlines that can securely send messages between multiple potential adversaries. And so, just a few things there that are, might seem like low-hanging fruit. They've been low-hanging fruit for like many, many years because actually they're very difficult things to do. And you have to get a lot of countries to sign up and you have to move past a lot of political barriers. But just a couple things there, and I'm more than happy to just open the floor for other people to jump in because there's a lot to get into with that question. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much for that incredibly rich response. Does anybody want to jump in straight off of that? Or, kind of off of the back of that, I was going to ask Jack the next question. I'll just keep going that. But it was more about Professor Pelopidas. Would you like to jump in?
Yeah, just to make one observation of context around what Matt was saying, and it's just I don't know what you guys know, so this might be obvious to everyone, but one thing that you need to keep in mind is that the whole conversation we're having is in a situation in which we could have specific discussions about the other arsenals. But if we're talking about the US arsenal and the arsenal of the Russian Federation, those arsenals are far in excess of the requirements of nuclear deterrence as defined by the militaries of those states. I'm saying that simply because, the conversation has this thing about nuclear weapons means deterrence. So you should know that we are in a situation where there are many additional missions on top of the deterrence missions that are allocated to nuclear weapons. So it's not as if we're like at the lowest possible levels for deterrence, and that's where the challenge is. Just an element of context that Matt knows that really well. I just thought that was important as a starting point.
Thank you so much. I do think that is a very important point to just reiterate, if not just clarify, and just so that is at the forefront of everybody's mind, because it is, an insanely important aspect. Well, given that, Jack, what, if any, role should nuclear weapons play then in national security strategies, if they're already far exceeding where they actually should be?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? Like that's the whole question of having these weapons is should they have a role? And if you ask me personally, and I would imagine that almost all of us, if not all of us, agree that like it'd be great if they didn't have any role at all. But I think we also all realize that that's not the world that we live in. It's certainly not reflective of today's state of play. And although I'm not necessarily sure that I would call myself a pessimist, I'm not sure I see that being the state of play for tomorrow or the next day either. I think when we talk about medium term, longer term, we have opportunities through programs like this, through the work that so many of my co-panelists are doing to change this down the road. But in the meantime, this is what we're stuck with. And how do we operate within that environment? So, like, that's a great question. I have a couple of thoughts, and then I'd have a couple of ideas on how we get to that long-term solution. But equally, I would love nothing more than for someone to disagree with any of these points, because I think because this is at the crux of this entire nuclear issue, one of the points I'll make later is that we all need to be better about listening to other ideas and bringing new points of perspective into the conversation. But I kind of, first of all, get ahead of myself, but also preempt some things that I think might be helpful for other questions as well later on in the evening. So I think, like, at the very start of all of this, right, what a nuclear weapon is mass destruction. And from a historical perspective, states have historically leveraged mass destruction in conflicts. This is not new, right? We can go all the way back, way back centuries. And there have been cases of, massive destructive seizes that, as was just said a minute ago, go beyond deterring an enemy. You're going to flat out raise a city, raise a civilization. You're trying to destroy for the purpose of destruction. I'm not saying necessarily that every single nuclear weapon state has that front of mind when they're thinking about their arsenal, but this is a principle that historically has been incorporated into national decision-making strategies. I'm also not saying that they aren't thinking that in front of mind. I'm just saying that this is kind of the historical context of this idea of incorporating mass destruction into national security strategies. And then there's a separate conversation about, is destruction about national security? And that, to me, I think is where the deterrence part of this comes in. But before, because deterrence is a lot bigger than nuclear weapons, obviously. So if we narrow down to nuclear weapons first, right? What makes nuclear weapons different than historic the end of World War II levels of mass destruction, is that nuclear weapons have exponentially increased the scope and the speed at which that destruction can happen. So not only is it significantly larger with a significantly physically smaller item, but it's also now, right, as little as 6 minutes, if that, for anyone to respond to this. And I think there are some great IR discussions that I won't get into that talk about how this is potentially kind of, since the 60s, totally changed the way that, like, strategy is adapted and all of these things. I'm not a military scientist. I won't go into that. But I think that's important for context, right? That historically, this is something that's been around. It's just that nuclear weapons completely rewrote the rules of that game. With that said, and kind of bouncing back to the sneak peek that I mentioned of deterrence earlier, this idea that if you believe a couple of things, right? If you believe that a nuclear weapon arsenal exists purely for deterrent purposes, and I think that there, as has already kind of previously been said, lots of evidence to indicate that some nuclear weapon states believe or intend to use it beyond that, or have at least threatened to use it beyond that. By adopting that nuclear deterrence strategy and legitimizing the role of nuclear weapons in your national security strategy, it's a weighty decision. And again, it would be great if it hadn't been made, but the fact that at least 9 countries now, right, have decided that this is something that they're willing to take on, I think it's important to understand what they're taking on, in addition to the fact that you have now made yourself a part of this kind of really difficult, and staying optimistic, anyway, difficult but surely solvable eventually challenge that we're all trying to tackle now. And these additional kind of complications are on a couple of different lines of inquiry, right? The first is that it's expensive, financially incredibly costly, but also politically incredibly costly. That's always been true, but I think now it's true in a different way. Since the dawn, I know we'll talk about it later, but the dawn of the TPNW, this emergence of the new, like, third nuclear age, you're not only agreeing to take on or agreeing to continue to burden the political cost of having this weapon that in theory could threaten other nuclear weapon states, right? Hopefully that's it. But you're now also at risk of alienating, particularly in I think this is true for the Western nuclear weapon states, alienating the global South. Alienating partners that everyone comes to these international forums and said, we're going to work with you, except on this thing that pretty much everyone universally agrees on, and we're still not going to enter into a conversation with you about this. So that's always been costly, but I think there's a new added political cost that's been around maybe for the last 10 years or so that's only getting worse. And this, again, is kind of a sneak peek at a point that I'm going to make in a little bit. There are also moral questions around the idea of embracing nuclear deterrence in your national security strategy. At the heart of it, if you're trying to deter an attack, right, you have to draw a red line at some point. How vulnerable can your citizens be and still not meet the threshold for responding with a second strike or nuclear retaliation? How much vulnerability are you willing to let your citizens adopt or force them to adopt on your behalf, right? Before you decide that enough is enough and we're going to retaliate with nuclear weapons. When you bring in kind of this equation that if you're going to use nuclear weapons, and this has, I think, been more explicitly stated by some countries than others, you're using them because one's been used on you. Are you stopping it saying the only cost I'm going to tolerate is a nuclear attack on our own population, on our own populace? And I think different countries have said they have different answers to these kinds of questions, but it's one more thing to think about. It's an additional calculus. It's an additional cost that you now have to worry about as part of your national security strategy. It's also difficult to scale responses. There's this issue of proportionality. So you either don't use nuclear weapons or you do use nuclear weapons. And in theory, there is no in between. And you can talk about strategic nuclear weapons or tactical nuclear weapons, but to keep it really simple, you either don't use them or you've agreed to use nuclear weapons, right? Going back to that kind of gray area, it's also incredibly difficult to then promise and guarantee that you can control how that escalates once you agree to flip that switch, right? So you're kind of agreeing to a little bit of uncertainty, and you can write everything you want in a doctrine or in a statement or say it during a meeting. And thankfully, we haven't had to worry about this. But if a nuclear conflict were to break out, right, there's no guaranteeing how that would go or who else would decide to get involved or what would be attacked and in what way that might change the calculus. So again, just one more cost in terms of this uncertainty of how it would fester and grow and unravel. That I'm not sure anyone has a great deal of confidence that it would be a tit for tat once and be done. Because we don't know, right? And I think we're all human. We all understand what it's like to be scared and to be uncertain and to want to do what you think is right to protect yourself. And with nuclear weapons, that becomes an existential risk. There's also an interesting question. I know that we kind of wanted to tie it into some recent things. Not that I'm an expert on India or Pakistan or their nuclear arsenals, but this idea of just having nuclear weapons raise or lower the acceptable level of conventional conflict, right? If you know that your other adversary, in this instance anyway, has a threshold at which they use nuclear weapons, does that then enable you to leverage more conventional force up until, but not quite at that red line, as opposed to maybe not doing that as blatantly or as part of your strategy or anticipating your adversary to do that as part of their strategy? And I realize I'm posing lots of questions. I don't have answers to all of these. But again, I think these kind of like 4 additional things to consider in your national security strategy by adopting nuclear weapons into that strategy are things to keep in mind while we're talking about all of these other additional existential risks that nuclear weapons pose. As I said earlier, clearly at least 9 different governments have agreed that they are willing to take on these extra risks, these extra decision-making apparatus. Hopefully, right, we're expecting and anticipating that they're going to think about and have answers for all of these questions. A great example for this is the UK in this kind of wider trend that Matt mentioned earlier of doubling down that everyone seems to be doing. So the UK's new Strategic Defense Review re-emphasized the role of nuclear weapons in its national security. This week, it's committed to joining NATO's nuclear deterrent. There are open questions about whether this means hosting US nuclear weapons. It certainly means purchasing aircraft that could carry them as opposed to just having this kind of minimum deterrent at the moment. This is also happening elsewhere where the US extended deterrent is becoming less certain in South Korea, Japan, Germany, Poland. For now, and changing governments, I think, have opened up new questions about, is it worth the cost of incorporating this into our own security strategy? And as long as this is the case, as long as this is the trend, and as I said earlier, I, to be frank, don't see it changing in the near term, these governments also have an obligation to think carefully and responsibly about how these weapons are incorporated. And that's a very Contentious question. I think it's very fair to debate whether or not you can be a responsible nuclear weapon state, whether or not you can behave responsibly. I would argue that maybe that's a possibility in the current situation we find ourselves in. But it takes a lot, and I'm not really convinced that any government right now is doing enough to do that. All of which goes to say, I think that's where we are. How do we get to where we want to be? It's an equally interesting question. And I think it's kind of something that we'll maybe talk more about later in the evening again. But I have a couple of ideas. One is one that is not new or not mine, and I think is much easier said than done, or we would have done this by now, but having innovative approaches to arms control regimes. I think we can make that a conversation about the NPT versus the TPNW. I think it can be and should be a conversation about New START. I think it also is a conversation about how do we bring other people to the table now that we live in this more multipolar nuclear weapons state, right? So if you believe that China potentially would be interested in engaging with the US in some kind of negotiations, someone at an event that I was at a couple of months ago, and I wish I could think of who it was because it was a really legitimate point, said, do you think that China is going to agree to anything that Russia hasn't already agreed to with the US? Maybe not. Which then means, is it worth talking about China negotiating with the US, or is it more important to look to other partners like the UK, like France, for example, to say, are there opportunities here for us to all sign a paper and do something on the use of AI in nuclear systems? If Russia has said it's off the table, maybe there are other countries that are saying we'd still be willing to talk about this. Re-engaging the public sphere, I talked about earlier, and others have talked about as well. FAS has been writing some incredible stuff in the Washington Post, and it's been getting great traction. Not to shout out Matt again, but to shout out Matt again. We need more of that. We need more of bringing these stories into the public space, right? Denis Villeneuve's decision to produce this movie on the nuclear war scenario, huge idea. We need more of that because people have to be re-engaged. If the idea is we are going to try to generate some genuine momentum behind the humanitarian initiative in democratic governments, the TPNW I think is one forum for doing that. If people believe that's the correct way to go about it, I think there are lots of other ways that complement enforced or formal treaties that are more kind of about pop culture, to put it simply. And so I think this is good, but we need more of it. And then my last big point, and then I promise I'm done. I realize I've rambled as I usually do, and I'm so sorry. Is that we have to reconsider these camps that we're all in. Whether or not we want to talk about camps, we are, right? And I think if you distill it into deterrence versus disarmament, as I think is really easy to do, and not without its merits, that's a divide that isn't helpful anymore. That's a divide that's been around for decades and existed in a world where, at least in the West, and I think if we want to be really specific, at least in the US, you had people in charge who cared about three things: norms, the rule of law, and a reliance on expertise. Hopefully, not to get political, hopefully, that's something that might become important and relevant again in capitals around the world. But at the moment, it doesn't seem to be in every single place where you hope it would be. Which means that these two camps that have essentially had these guardrails to exist and argue and debate, but then still be pulled back into the room, everyone's out of the room now, if that makes any sense. If that's an okay way for me to frame that. So this growing dissonance isn't helpful. And I think if we're going to get past this roadblock, we have to be willing to acknowledge the other side. You have to be willing to say maybe the TPNW isn't perfect, right? You have to be willing to say that. You also have to be willing to say the NPT isn't perfect and the P5 aren't doing enough to make it better. And you have to be willing to say both of those things in the same sentence and then listen to the other person who disagrees with you. My new goal is that when I walk into an event, I want everyone to be a little bit annoyed with me because I don't totally agree with anyone. Not a great way to make friends, but I think if we're all really, really, really passionate about reducing the role of nuclear weapons in national security strategies, if we're working towards the long-term goal of reducing nuclear risk, we all have to come back to the table and stop saying, well, I'm not going to talk to the other side because they're not listening to me anymore. That might be true. Doesn't matter. We can't afford to have the luxury of academic debate anymore. That time, in my mind, has passed. So I don't know. I think maybe I was kind of that's been my motto. I don't know, for the last couple of months, and I plan on doing more with that. And I think we all should. So I'll end it there. Mostly because I think I've gone way over the 5 to 10 minutes that were suggested. But happy to talk more about it later on.
Thank you. No, thank you so much. That was again really rich, and there's so much there to unpack. I feel like does anybody want to jump on that straight away? Otherwise, I can kind of yes, because I was going to ask you the next question anyways, but yeah, it does tie into that. But please go ahead.
Yeah, so sorry, I was tempted to do the same thing as I did before because what Jack is telling us, I mean, at least the first part of the discussion was a discussion about the practice of nuclear deterrence and like what that entails and how that works. So as background, again, I want to make sure that everyone in the call understands that this notion that the world of nuclear deterrence is a world in which nuclear weapons do not explode is a construction. Because literally, in not all, but most nuclear weapon states, historically, the proponents of nuclear deterrence have claimed that there was a need for nuclear testing, and in particular, atmospheric nuclear testing with massive health and environmental consequences as a requirement to make deterrence credible. So I'm not validating that that was a requirement. I'm just telling you, if historically the proponents of nuclear deterrence said and claimed that it was a requirement, we need to reconnect nuclear deterrence in the historical production of arsenals for the purpose of nuclear deterrence with the foreseeable and actual consequences of nuclear testing. And just to give you a scale, we need to remember that there are 543 atmospheric nuclear tests, which essentially are the equivalent in yield of 29,000, and you heard me, Hiroshima. In Kazakhstan alone, for instance, Dr. Casanova says 1 million people have been affected by nuclear testing. If we're talking about one test in Polynesia, my friend Sébastien Philippe has documented that over 100,000 people have been contaminated beyond what would give them right to compensation. So again, the practice of nuclear deterrence does not mean no explosion, is my core point. The second thing is that we need to keep in mind the cases, and I'm not going to go long on this, that in some instances, possessing nuclear weapons had an emboldenment effect. It enabled risk-taking or aggression. And, you have recent examples, but as far back as Stalin in the Korean War, you could see that. I told you the point about luck. And for those of you who are interested in climate change, you might be interested in the fact that, again, here using the data that Matt and his colleagues have diligently compiled, we have built, or I should say that 10 historical nuclear weapon states, if we count South Africa, have overall built over 120,000 of those things, most of which were then dismantled. We do not have a sense of the carbon footprint of building and dismantling those things. So that's just a prelude, of me telling you, isolating nuclear weapons in connection to deterrence and no explosion massively underestimates the consequences of building and relying on those things so far. That's just what I wanted to say.
Well, actually, I was going to ask you to elaborate more on the whole concept of disarmament in today's context, given obviously the importance that nuclear weapons now play in national security strategies, and kind of whether the concept of nuclear disarmament is even still attainable in that sense, since it's kind of going the opposite direction right now, and that is not really at the forefront of anybody's minds, especially given the escalating tensions of the recent weeks. So yeah, if you'd like to give your take on that, please.
Okay. So I'll first, speak to this notion of the concept versus the reality. And then we'll talk about reality and possibility of nuclear disarmament. On this, I will tell you, I think, 5 things, and I will do that in 6 minutes max. If not, just slap me. So concept and reality. The concept of nuclear disarmament, that one of the challenges is that it could mean a process, like we all agree and we say we are engaging in a disarmament process that doesn't tell us when it starts, how fast it goes, whatever. Or it could mean the same word, the outcome of that process, which is okay. Disarmament means achieving disarmament. And so obviously, the fact that we use the same word to say the process or an outcome of that process can create endless illusions of agreement with no practical consequences other than deadlocks. The second observation is that we've all talked so far about arms control, and it's crucial to keep in mind the distinction between disarmament and arms control. In political and strategic history, arms control was crafted and created as replacement for disarmament. The arms controllers were opposed to disarmament. And the point of arms control is crisis stability, and in general, stability with and thanks to nuclear weapons. When obviously, and you're like, oh God, why did they invite Benoit to say such trivial things? Disarmament is about security without nuclear weapons. So keep in mind this distinction that literally disarmament is security without or security against nuclear weapons, when arms control is stability thanks to well-managed nuclear weapons. Now, the reality of nuclear disarmament and possibility of it, I promised 5 observations. The first one would be that we now have substantive evidence that the general claim that we all want a world without nuclear weapons and the only challenge is the practicalities is just false. There is a set of actors who've shown by their action that they're committed to the perpetual continuation of a world in which security is achieved with nuclear weapons. And there is another set of actors which seeks security against nuclear weapons. And we need to accept that this is the place of political struggle of the moment. And I would contend it reveals a place of political struggle of the entire nuclear age that hadn't been as visible as it has been in recent years. The second observation is the persisting role of surprises in nuclear history. So I think we all agree that from where we stand now, notions of nuclear disarmament or notions of progress seem unusually difficult to achieve. But the thing is, in nuclear history, what did not seem possible actually happened very frequently. The INF treaty that we all like and mourn, so the first treaty that canceled an entire category of weapons, when they started negotiating it, was at a period of massive tension between the US and the Soviet Union. Everyone said, like, it's never going to work. And it happened, it canceled an entire category of weapons. Similarly, South Africa gave up a very small, but gave up a nuclear arsenal. That wasn't planned. That was unprecedented. People said no one will ever do that. They did it. Similarly, nuclear weapons located in Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan were transferred peacefully to the Russian Federation. And there was US Russian cooperation for the transition after the collapse of a nuclear armed state. Same thing, unprecedented. People would have said, you can't do that. It happened. So what I'm saying here is there's no reason to think that we're more clairvoyant than we were in the past. And so in the past, the good surprises happened and people said they were impossible. We're just saying they're impossible. That doesn't mean that they won't happen. That just means we are in a difficult critical juncture. The third observation is this is not blind optimism, like, sit down and wait. Having those surprises work required containing and defeating the pro-nuclear weapons constituencies. So then let's talk about, how do you do that? And those are my last 2 points. One is about the futures. A lot of this debate is presentist. That is, it assumes that the features of today's world will remain the features of the world for the foreseeable future. And that mode of thinking has a set of assumptions that make change more difficult than it needs to be. So, for instance, it creates a sense, and here I might be influenced by the fact that I'm looking at it from Paris. In France, essentially the entire discussion assumes that obviously in any possible future, you're better off with the nuclear weapons you have now than without them. Everyone treats that as obvious. And my observation here is there are possible worlds in which that's true. There are possible worlds in which that's indifferent. And there are possible worlds in which that's just false. And nuclear weapons are a liability. So, for instance, if the hacking of nuclear weapons and of your nuclear weapons becomes a possibility, then obviously having them becomes a liability. I'm not an oracle. I have no idea whether that's possible or not, but I'm just forcing you to open your minds. Like, very serious people think about the possibility of hacking as a possibility, and that's a set of futures in which the value and utility of nuclear weapons would change dramatically. Similarly, I suppose most of you care about environmental politics and realize that it's not just a carbon problem. So if we take the planetary boundaries seriously, you realize that the effects of planetary boundaries will make the maintenance of nuclear weapons and the securing of them much more costly. So they will become an opportunity cost, and that might create even situations in which deterrence relationships are destabilized. We have multiple papers published on this. So the idea really is, when you think about the future and when you have conversations about these things, take into account the effects of planetary boundaries on nuclear weapons, instead of assuming that they are kind of sheltered from the rest of the world. So think of them as opportunity costs and as increasingly dangerous in a climate transformed world. My fifth and final point is the notion of utopia. You will note that in the nuclear weapons debate, I would say there is a race for realism. Everyone wants to claim, my position is a realistic position. The other ones are utopians, they don't really know what they're talking about. What I want to tell you is that in a world in which we have a large number of nuclear weapons, and our threshold of tolerability is that none should explode without a desire for it to happen, we have to be utopian or to accept that we will all die in a non-nuclear disaster. Let me explain what I mean by that. So, one possible future is that we will live with large levels of nuclear weapons in perpetuity, and none of them will ever explode except when we want it. That means things could fail and could go wrong, but they will go wrong in ways that don't explode. So they will go wrong in ways that we like. And you see, in the way I phrase it, that's called technological utopianism. That's what it is. And obviously, calling for disarmament, complete nuclear disarmament, is unprecedented in one way, which is we haven't been at zero, but in terms of dismantlement of nuclear weapons, we've dismantled way more than we have left. So then you can call that, if you want, a political utopia. But then literally the futures you have and the choice you have is between the political utopia of disarmament, the technological utopia of nuclear weapons in perpetuity, or accepting that things will be okay because we will all die from a non-nuclear phenomenon, which is also a possibility. So don't let the realism label disrupt the conversation. If you get accused of being utopian, you just bring the utopian imperative as a way of leveling the playing field so that you actually have a conversation about plausible futures. So those were my 5 observations. I hope they help.
Thank you so much, because I do think that especially the future-oriented thinking is quite an important point, and it's also one that we try to really emphasize here with especially with our work as well. But yeah, to bridge the gap a bit, thematic jump back to more present situation, unfortunately, because we do have to deal with the present issues at hand. But to Andrey, my next question, and it would be that in what ways has the reemergence of nationalist politics, not only in Russia and China, but also in the US, specifically recently, well, or before the 4 years before, last 4 years, but and Europe have affected the perception and the practice of nuclear arms diplomacy, because it has changed dramatically, I would say, over the last few years, and has kind of turned into something new and also something different that we haven't seen in a while. So yeah, how would you assess that?
Thank you, and I will try to be brief. So nationalist politics are often associated with quest for strengths and less interest in cooperation with others and less interest in limiting your options, which can also mean more conflict, which can mean bad relations with the countries you might have arms control with, and in the process you might sometimes lose arms control agreements. And generally, arms control by necessity is about seeking agreements with others and looking for compromises. In this world, arms control might not be in vogue. Arms control proponents are labeled as idealistic and weak, and the longer you don't have arms control agreements, the less possible it all looks. I look at this position from, Russia-West relations, and, 5 years ago, Russia had permanent mission to NATO, and there was Russian ambassador in Brussels engaging with NATO countries, and there was representative of NATO in Moscow. Now this looks like impossible because Russia and NATO are the worst enemies. So yeah, you don't even need much time to pass. That things which used to be normal before become not normal. I believe that people will still do the right things after trying everything else. because there is a lot of useful things coming from arms control, even if you are ultra-nationalist politician. Arms control gives you stability, transparency, predictability, saving resources, and we talked about that. And you can take such nationalist politicians as President Nixon, President Reagan, and also U.S. president is different from them as President Carter, and they very much in the end embraced arms control, decided arms control is worth it. And you had Secretary General Brezhnev, who was quite a nationalistic leader, also agreeing to arms control and to arms limitations. And you listen to President Trump, who during his first term scrapped Iran nuclear deal. Now he's looking for ways in his way to engage with Iran, to have some kind of agreement. You can call it arms control agreement, you can call it by other things, but at least there is understanding that there are things which you cannot get with just bombing people, and you still have to come up to some sort of agreement with them. But of course, this is a very abstract question. In practice, it's all heavily dependent on what country you're talking about, what the leadership of this country thinks. I would argue that President Putin is much closer to Secretary General Brezhnev than President Trump to President Reagan. China, for example, had very little experience of nuclear arms control, unlike the Soviet Union and then Russia. So that would be instructing its leadership, thinking about those things. So to answer your questions, it's not really cool to be an arms control diplomat in nationalist politics, but I would say it's very context dependent, and I don't see nationalist politics as impossible for nuclear arms control when the stars align. And just one short comment to Benoit. When you mentioned at the beginning that deterrence, we have much more nuclear weapons than is necessary for deterrence, and that's how you know that that's something fishy is going on. Again, I would like to people on this call and in the room understand deterrence is not a physical thing. It's a rather abstract concept. So it's really hard to say if something serves a deterrence value, because deterrence value is what you have to threaten to make sure you are deterring a country from doing something you don't want. Is threatening one city enough? Then you'll find with one warhead, and one warhead provides you all the deterrence you need. Do you need to threaten all of the nuclear weapons of your opponent? If that's how you see the deterrence, then you might need thousands of nuclear weapons. And that's an unfortunate truth about nuclear weapons policy. Quite a lot of those things are only in people's heads, so they cannot be really proven one way or the other. And that's how a lot of our discussions, disagreements, and debates spanning decades continue, because we don't have nuclear wars. Luckily, we cannot prove a lot of things, so we kind of assume, and different people assume different things. And I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Does anybody want to jump in on that, or then I can?
I guess I can clarify that.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So what I mean when I say in excess from the requirements of deterrence is, I guess two observations. One, and I think that's a lesson for you all. You should not trust either of us or anyone else, regardless of evidence. And so I'm a boring old school scholar. So if I don't know, I say I don't know. The reason why I say this is because it's essentially established by scholars such as David Rosenberg, Lynn Eden, and Daniel Ellsberg. I'm happy to give you the references. And the point simply is I'll give you the US case because that's easier. And also, I can't speak Russian and I haven't spoken to David, so I would get the Russian notions wrong. But the one thing I had in mind is that in the US, you had the weapons allocated to the deterrence mission, and then there is another mission which is called damage limitation should deterrence fail. And so that I would count as on top of the deterrence mission. If you had only the deterrence mission, you would be able to have way fewer weapons. And actually, in a 2009 report to the US Congress, the report from the commission headed by Bill Perry and Jim Schlesinger, they have this line where they said, if we were committed to, the security of the homeland and deterrence only, we would be able to have way fewer weapons. So the whole logic of extending nuclear deterrence to the allies is also an additional set of missions. So that's what I mean. It's like it's not necessarily it should be understood as me saying they secretly want nuclear war or things like that, but simply observing that there are additional missions that pile up on top of the deterrence mission.
Thank you so much for the response, and I'm enjoying. I'm happy that we're having a conversation going. But yeah, no, I do want to ask Dr. Zhao my one question I have prepared for him. And yeah, it would essentially just be that how we would, because obviously it's a lot easier to assess different nuclear arms controls and different nuclear strategies the more we know about that state's program. And there are states who have primed themselves on their opacity and their kind of more secretive practices, and that we just don't have as much information about. So that would be like, for example, I'm thinking of China, or more recently and more relevantly Israel, North Korea. But how do we kind of interpret that, their nuclear modernization and expansion, especially China's recent, or for the last few years, their nuclear policies in that regard? How could you speak to that?
I think it's it's useful to look at the Chinese case, because what has happened to China's nuclear program is exactly the opposite of what we have expected the international nuclear order to develop. China used to be the most self-restrained nuclear power. The government has never said anything about even the rough size of its nuclear arsenal, but for decades, according to foreign government assessments and open source research, we kind of know that for a very long time, China had maintained a very small nuclear arsenal of about 200 nuclear warheads. In contrast to thousands, if not tens of thousands of nuclear warheads in the two big nuclear superpowers. So the hope was, the big superpowers will follow the Chinese suit, and so everyone will gradually reduce their nuclear arsenal to smaller and smaller numbers, and they will adopt the Chinese policy that is based on very relaxed nuclear posture. China did not maintain a high alert status of its nuclear weapons. China reportedly separated its nuclear warheads from the delivery systems, missiles, bombers, etc. in peacetime, and had stored the warheads in separate locations from missiles. So that reduced the risk of incidental nuclear use. So the hope was everyone would, follow the Chinese model, reducing numbers, relaxing their nuclear posture. So eventually we would gradually come closer to global zero. But it's the opposite that we are seeing today. China is actually following the nuclear major powers. and especially in recent years, is rapidly building up its nuclear arsenal, and is also following the operational practice of other nuclear major powers by adopting rapid launch capabilities. It is aimed to develop a comprehensive strategic early warning network so that China can conduct launch under attack or launch on warning nuclear strikes. And under these developments, China's insistence on secrecy has a major impact on the emerging arms competition, because despite its very, very fast nuclear expansion, which can be visibly observed through commercial satellite images, and Matt and his team has done some of the most cutting edge work using commercially available data to assess and track China's nuclear build-up process. But despite all such widely available information in the public domain, the Chinese government still hasn't provided any information about why China is building up suddenly, right? After decades of maintaining a very small nuclear arsenal, what specific military objective is China trying to achieve through a much larger and more diversified nuclear arsenal? And how many nuclear weapons, how many more is China trying to build eventually, right? What's the end point? And without such basic information, it's almost inevitable that China's rivals, especially the United States, is using worst-case scenario assumptions to assess Chinese intent and to plan for America's countermeasures. And indeed, this is what's happening in Washington, where I am based. The discussion here is all about how the United States should deal with this unprecedented nuclear threat called two nuclear near peers, right? They have been operating on the assumption that within about 10 years, by 2035, China is likely to build a roughly similar size of operationally deployed strategic nuclear arsenal as the United States, of about 1,500 nuclear warheads. And many people actually believe that that's the minimum that China might build. In fact, they think China will build many more than that. And China might even want to achieve a nuclear superiority over the United States, and wanting to be able to conduct disarming first strike against American nuclear arsenal. So this type of thinking is driving the United States to react very strongly to the Chinese buildup. So that's what is fueling the current nuclear competition between the two big powers. And internally, the secrecy is also having a huge impact on China's own capacity to conduct, to conduct reasonable nuclear policy deliberation and to ensure nuclear accountability, as Benoit has been, talking about. There is declining accountability in the process of China's internal nuclear making process when, under Mr. Xi Jinping, the country is becoming much more authoritarian than before. And all the strategic decisions, including nuclear decisions, are kept secret from the broader Chinese expert community. right, including many top military and civilian nuclear policy experts. Today, they are, basically excluded from internal nuclear policy deliberation. They are not informed of China's nuclear decisions, and they unfortunately have to rely on the work of Matt and his team to understand what China is doing about its own nuclear buildup and to speculate with very little, empirical data about what China might want to achieve going forward. Even many Chinese international interlocutors, including senior officials from the Foreign Ministry's Arms Control Department, who are in charge of international negotiation on arms control and nuclear issues, they are not aware of many of the documents written by the PLA, by the Chinese military. Right. And as a scholar, I have done more independent research into those PLA writings. And when I brought these documents up, when talking with Chinese senior diplomats, they genuinely believe I'm making things up, right? And they accuse me of making things up to demonize China. So the internal secrecy and compartmentalization also makes effective international communication less likely to happen. So that's why I think secrecy is a real challenge. But now let me quickly zoom out a little bit and I think draw a couple broader observations. Because in theory, when countries came up with nuclear weapons, when they established some type of mutual nuclear deterrence relationship, that nuclear deterrence relationship was supposed to only provide a temporary security and temporary stability so that countries don't need to immediately go to another world war. And so they may be able to buy time to actually work out their underlying political disagreements and strategic rivalry. Right? Nuclear deterrence was never meant to be a permanent security solution. It was meant to buy time, right? It is a dangerous security solution. There are many risks of miscalculation, etc. But perhaps we can use that time to fundamentally mitigate our political disagreements, our rivalry, to the point that we would no longer need nuclear weapons to maintain basic security and peaceful coexistence. Right? But the irony is this sense of security provided by mutual nuclear deterrence actually worked to disincentivize countries to work on their underlying problems. And they felt they could prioritize other issues. In China, for example, the government prioritized regime security over anything else. And as a result, there has been systematic measures to strengthen internal control, including on the free flow of information between China and the outside world, including systematic measures to manage and influence public opinion, to the point that today the Chinese-American rivalry has reached an unprecedented level. And the two societies, the Chinese society and the American society, they have developed fundamentally divergent views on basic factual issues, right? Including, key developments in history, right? They, across history and contemporary affairs, they have developed totally different views on the basic facts, right? So, and because of the societal level information and perception gap, their rivalry, they reached radical conclusions about each other's strategic intent. China, for example, has convinced itself that the US strategic culture is, is dominated by hegemonic thinking. And there's no way the US would ever accommodate China's rise. And that's why they think the United States has been adopting containment measures, the so-called containment measures to make problems for China. So they become increasingly disillusioned that the problems between US and China can be resolved through communication, diplomacy, or persuasion. Right? That's the fundamental driver of Chinese nuclear buildup. They think the only way China can compel the United States to accept Chinese perspectives and to accept China as is, to accept the Chinese system and regime as is to build up its strategic power to the point that the United States will realize it can do nothing to change Chinese thinking, to change Chinese system. That's how to maintain peace and stability, according to this line of logic. And I'm afraid on the other side, we are seeing similar developments. The US, looking at what China is doing, both internally and externally, including very secretive nuclear buildup, has increasingly reached the conclusion that it's almost impossible to change Chinese behavior through diplomacy. So US also needs to build up its power to strengthen its deterrence. Just in case China has, expansionist objectives beyond South China Sea or Taiwan, etc. And this also relates back to the nuclear strategy the United States has been developing. Because as Benoit said, if countries are satisfied with basic deterrence, they only need perhaps a handful of nuclear weapons to hold each other's big cities at risk for deterrence. But because of the growing underlying rivalry, the growing distrust about each other's intent and strategic culture, the US thinking is it is not enough to deter Chinese attacking of American cities, but in fact, if nuclear war somehow started, the United States cannot trust that China would ever behave as a rational actor. That China might use nuclear weapons massively. There might be no capacity to control the escalation, to the point the United States has to assume the worst and start destroying remaining Chinese nuclear weapons as much as possible. So that's the logic behind damage limitation that Benoit was discussing. And the reason I think there is consistent interest in Washington in damage limitation is this persistent distrust of China's decision making. The distrust that the two societies share enough common value to make the United States confident that nuclear escalation can be controlled. A nuclear war, once occurred, can be maintained at a limited level, right? So fundamentally, I think the lesson, since this group, when I look at your website and the materials, is interested in long-term thinking, the long-term theory of change, right? How do we bring about a paradigm shift in international relations so that we can escape the current dilemma of nuclear deterrence and competition and arrive at a better alternative? I think might be useful to reflect on some of the broader themes. And as a result, I personally increasingly convinced that we have to promote democratic governance, both internally within a country and internationally, and to promote people's confidence and belief in the rule of law, right? Both internally to ensure accountable nuclear decision making, or more broadly, accountable
security policy, foreign policy making, and internationally, so that countries still have trust in commonly agreed rules and principles of behaviors in managing international relations. That's what is really lacking today. And with the profound changes taking place in Washington under the Trump administration, that prospect of promoting commonly agreed norms, principles, and rules is becoming, less. So I also want to encourage the group to think more deeply, in order to understand what's the fundamental problem we are facing. And I think nuclear is a good case study through which we can gain some useful insights. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I personally couldn't agree more. And yeah, no, thank you so much for your expertise on this other part of the nuclear policy considerations. If anybody wants to do a short intervention on that, please go ahead. Otherwise, I would open the floor to the Q&A section looking at the time, just because I know the participants have been preparing some questions that will either be for a specific person or just posed in general. Our idea was to have a sort of empty chair thing happening over here. However, I do think there were technical difficulties with the feedback on this laptop before, which is why we might just make this the empty chair. Yes. Okay, so I will be getting up now, but I will find someone first to ask a question. And who wants to ask the first question? Do you want to come? So we'll do this. Either they feel comfortable enough to sit over here and ask you the questions themselves and introduce themselves real quick, or I'll sit back down. You can see me again, and then I'll ask the question. They write them down and give them to me. But yeah, then we'll go. Okay, here we go.
Hi, Chingwei here. It's wonderful to see so many familiar faces. I hope everyone's doing well. A quick question for Andrey and Tong Zhao. So about the Golden Dome specifically, right? So politically, it's very escalatory, but in reality, due to the scientific issues with its feasibility and the track record of terrestrial missile defense, I wonder if you have a sense about how much China and Russia are actually worried about this from a security perspective. Because it's interesting that the Russian Federation was initially really publicly critical of it. And then recently they had a new statement sort of toning down the criticism as well, referring to it as a sovereign US decision. So I'm just wondering if there's a sort of nuance in how Russia and China are taking it, will be responding to it. And I'd appreciate your thoughts on that. Thank you.
You want us to answer straight away or collect questions, or what's the plan?
Lena says answer straight away.
Yes.
Yeah, I can maybe start with the Russian perspective. So, well, nuclear policy in Russia these days is in a lot of ways a function of Russia's general foreign policy, and on many occasions we've seen that it's can be decided basically based on what's going on in relations with the United States and Russia. So things like New START Treaty, which was kind of important for Russia, which Russia spent a lot of time discussing the extension with Trump administration, then Biden administration, then was just suspended because of the war in Ukraine. So in that sense, I think a lot of unclarity is because there is not a lot of clarity of Russia's position towards the United States currently. There is still hope that Russia can do business with Trump and with Trump administration. So seeing things which could have been major disruptors would be ignored in, trying to achieve this overall goal to amend U.S.-Russian relations under President Trump. Russia, of course, has quite diverse arsenal of nuclear weapons delivery systems, enough to penetrate whatever the Golden Dome can provide. Again, we're not sure if it will provide anything next administration after the Trump administration can scrap all of the plans. So those things take quite a bit of time to finalize. My biggest concern with Golden Dome, as a still Russian expert, is not that it can be really effective and it can make Russian second strike capability obsolete. It's more than, there is this famous quote by Donald Trump from his first presidency when he said, well, our missile defense has almost 100% success rate. So if you build something and if the president believes that his systems have this success rate, that would form his behavior. We've seen also a lot of conventional missile defenses being used in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and recently against US base in Qatar, where all of the missiles have been intercepted. So I think if you're conflating in your mind conventional missile defenses with nuclear missile defenses, and if you're overestimating what the nuclear missile defenses can do or could possibly do, then you might just, base your policies, your decisions on very wrong assumptions. So that's my bigger problem with Golden Dome and strategic missile defense as a whole.
And I'm happy to add a couple comments on Chinese perception on Golden Dome. So basically, for decades, China saw the American homeland missile defense as threatening to its nuclear deterrence because Chinese thinking is based on the assumption that in a major war between the two nations, the US would launch a disarming first strike on Chinese nuclear forces. And therefore, only a small number of Chinese nuclear weapons would survive. And to ensure deterrence, this small number of survived Chinese nuclear weapons need to be able to penetrate US homeland missile defense and deliver unacceptable damage to American targets. And therefore, even a modest-sized US homeland missile defense system could, in theory, neutralize Chinese capability to conduct nuclear retaliation. And therefore, the official Chinese response to the Golden Dome was, along this line that it would be very destabilizing for international security, would undermine the basic foundation of strategic stability among nuclear powers. And by the way, the planned space-based interceptors under Golden Dome could also be easily used as anti-satellite weapons. Right? At least that's a scenario that many Chinese experts are obsessed with. So they, for this and other reasons, they also see the U.S. Golden Dome as a major effort to so-called weaponize the outer space, and U.S. wants to continue its dominance in outer space. But within the Chinese expert community, they, I think their current assessment of the technical feasibility of Golden Dome is less alarming compared with when the US introduced the Star Wars initiative under Reagan, or when the US withdrew from the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile defense treaty in 2002 under President Bush. Today, China thinks it is in a different position in terms of relative capability. The American proposal of Golden Dome appears very technologically challenging and financially expensive. And China doesn't believe the US has the capacity to build a robust enough defense industrial base to materialize most components of the proposed Golden Dome, especially the space-based interceptors. It's just hard to see how the U.S. can operationally develop a satellite constellation that can intercept tens, let alone hundreds of missile, a salvo launch of Chinese or Russian or even North Korean ICBMs towards the United States using space-based interceptors. And such proposals are going to be so expensive that they will also crowd out the financial resources for other high priority American defense programs, including America's nuclear modernization program. So there will be important trade-offs for the United States. And for the United States to invest so much money into a strategic defensive system that is going to be much more expensive than China to build up its offensive missiles is viewed as a wasteful investment by the United States and bad strategic choice for Washington. So that's why I think China is actually relatively calm this time. And they also think the defense policy-making process in Washington under Trump is so chaotic and incoherent. They think there's a big chance the United States will going to screw up despite huge investment of resources into this program. So they are willing to see U.S. Wasting more resources and while closely monitoring the U.S. technological development and learn lessons from U.S. research and development, because China is also having its own multi-layered missile defense program. In fact, China just announced it is going to conduct a major military parade in September, on which many people speculate that China might reveal some of its newly developed strategic missile defense technologies, including interceptors that can deal with ICBMs. But there is still a lot of uncertainty. But I think at the operational level, China's experts will monitor what lessons they can draw from American investments and then avoid areas of technical challenge and more efficiently enhance China's own missile defense technologies.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much. And I look forward to seeing you guys again down the track. But thank you.